So really what we're going to do today is tell you a story about the work that we've been doing with seeds over the last 4 years as a group, and the history of that work over the last 20 or so years. But our particular story begins in 2020, when a small group of us were planning to visit Dr. Steve Jones at the Bread Lab at Washington State University. And when we were about to fly out to Seattle, something happened, and the flights were cancelled, and we didn't make that journey. And so instead, Steve Jones took us for a virtual tour through the trial plots at Washington State University to look at all the different work they were doing with cereals, in particular wheat. And we felt it was just massively inspiring, and we decided to have lockdown remote drinks every Friday where we would talk about what we'd seen and think about how we could implement some of that in the UK. And one of the first things we began discussing on those Friday nights was the difficulty, the legal challenges to the sharing of this diverse, resilient seed, and how we might begin to tackle that problem to make it legal for farmers to trade and exchange diverse cereal seeds that don't conform to DUS, that definition of distinct, uniform and stable, and aren't on the national list. So I'm going to do a little bit of context setting, and then I've got some fantastic speakers who will give you all the detail. So, the bad news. We all know the bad news. We face a complex web of crises, I think it would be fair to describe them. They're sometimes called a polycrisis, and it's this combination of geopolitical, economic, societal, technological, environmental issues that we have to tackle. Everything from climate change to biodiversity loss, through to things like the war in Ukraine and the impact that has to chronic ill health through poor diet, through to the problems we're having with the economy, and all those things are connected, and it can feel quite overwhelming. The good news is that that polycrisis, that is a completely disempowering and disabling concept. It's useless, it does nothing for us but stop us acting. And the thing that we need to remember is that we absolutely don't have to do everything. We have to work in the realm that we understand and begin to affect change in that place. And the great news is, as far as I'm concerned, we have all the tools we need to tackle that, whether it's economic, whether it's technological, whether it's social. We know what we need to do, we just need to start doing it. And there isn't a silver bullet, there's no single answer, but what there is a unifying concept which I think brings all these things together. And it's ridiculously simple, and that is diversity. On farms, in our context, on plates, and across the food system. And I began my life as an ecologist in the 90s, and then realised that food systems was where I could affect change in ecology. And I had the good fortune to meet Professor Martin Wolf, who established Wakers Agroforestry in the early 2000s. And Martin introduced me to a whole new level of diversity that I'd never really thought about. I'd spent my life, prior to that point, thinking about what goes on around the field. Martin was focused on what happens in the field and had begun work with the Organic Research Centre to create population wheats, these incredibly diverse cereals that had resilience to disease, had the capacity to adapt to climate change, and could offer, over a long period, consistent yields without inputs. Incredibly exciting. But no one was really finding a route to market for those crops that seemed like such an important answer. And in 2014, Martin and the Organic Research Centre, working with DEFRA, achieved a Europe-wide derogation which allowed for the marketing of YQ and several other populations, what we'll be calling heterogenous crops, through this piece, which is a word that simply expresses that diversity within the seed. And until 2021, we were trading those grains, exchanging them between farms, understanding what the routes to market were, telling stories to customers and eaters about how these grains were a potential solution to a really complex set of problems. And also in this room, there are other people who are doing similar work. Andy Forbes is probably here somewhere. I can see John Letts over there. And there's a big history and a big kind of building block of work that's been going on with diverse crops. So how are we actually doing? So this is the situation, really. Potentially, there are 300,000 edible plant species globally. About 200 of those are regularly eaten. 40 you might see in your supermarket, but just 3 comprise more than 50% of global calories. That's an extraordinary number, and all 3 of them are grasses. They're maize, they're wheat, and they're rice. And given that huge area, given the fact that the genetic diversity within those 3 species has been consistently narrowed over the last 100 years in order to fit in with production systems that focus on yield rather than resilience and nutrition, we face the potential for big problems. We already see how rust drifts in across Europe and takes out varieties and they break down and we can no longer grow them. So our mission or our aim over the last 4 years has been to attempt to find a way to allow farmers to experiment with these more diverse cereals in order, we hope, to find some small solutions to some of these incredibly tricky problems. I've got some great speakers up here with me. I've got Charlotte Bickler from the Organic Research Centre, Fred Price from Githelney Farm, Ed Dicken from Harper University College, I've got Stephen Jacobs from Organic Farmers and Growers, John Turner, a farmer at Little Bytham, and then finally I've got Rosie who's got some real treats for us at the end. We're going to reward you for your patience with biscuits. And what they're going to do is they're going to talk about their relationship with these diverse cereals. They're going to talk about what they like to grow, how they work from the perspective of a plant breeder, how they work from the perspective of a miller and a baker. And at the end we'll have time for some questions. So I'm going to let them push on with that narrative, think about the questions that you want to answer, and we'll have some time at the end for that. Thank you.
Do I have to turn it on? Okay, perfect. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Josiah, for the great introduction. So we've got a photo here of the first seed crop of ORC Waken's population being grown at Greenacres Farm in Shropshire in 2017. And this is the first seed crop at scale when we were allowed to begin marketing it. It was a real change in how we were doing things, because before that, every seed that was sold in the UK had to conform with the DUS criteria that Josiah introduced. This relaxation of the seed laws is known as a temporary experiment, and it ran from 2014 to 2021. So we find that there are a range of laws that impact how we can produce and exchange seeds. So this ranges from intellectual property to seed health and food safety. But the most challenging aspect which we were looking at during this experiment was around seed marketing laws and how we can relate to seed marketing when we have a genetically diverse crop that we're working with. What we see is that the laws that were developed were for a different time. It focused on industrial crop production, anonymous markets, and external and top-down control. And as Josiah said, we're now facing a different range of challenges, and we need to be able to adapt our systems to that and review how these laws work. So what we see in our current system can create barriers to innovation, innovation that is different to what we're kind of pushing for sometimes around diversity and ecology. And it creates prohibitive systems of administration and limits opportunity for smaller breeders and people that are trying to develop crops for small markets or less developed markets, because the controls in that create a lot of need for scale, especially at the beginning. So what we observed when we were working within this first framework in the 2014 to 2021 was that there were a number of challenges around how the current system for seed marketing determines and maintains control. And it's very much to do with the variety identification and description being tied into the seed. So we see that an individual plant of a variety can be used to say that that's that variety across the whole area that it's grown in, generally. But when we get to a more diverse cropping system, it becomes impossible to do that. So we have to look at a range of different features, and this can cover populations that have been generated in lots of different ways. So farmer selections, dynamic populations of outcrossing mixtures, and composite cross populations like ORC Waken's population, or YQ as it's known. So we worked with the Commission at a European level to understand what the key features that we needed to be able to monitor to change the system would look like, and these are what are described here. So there should be some kind of general understanding of the characteristics that you can expect from a variety or population. understanding of the breeding history, the parent material, the selection pressures that it's been exposed to, and where it's been produced and when. And that needs to be maintained from year to year as we understand that these populations can evolve in response to those selection pressures. So the regulation can define what a population is and then how we measure it, but these methods will be slightly different depending on the type of material that you're working with. And we're beginning to unpick that in more detail as we develop and grow these different types of crops. It's not a one-size-fits-all, so we have to keep adapting to that. The real emphasis that we see on the regulatory side is that we don't want people who have worked hard to register a variety then getting undermined in the system. So it's about showing that what we're growing as a population isn't just a registered variety and could have been registered through the DUS system or a mixture of those types of varieties. The main challenge within current marketing legislation is that the variety is used for the identity, and we need to find ways to work around that. And that really comes down to us working together to understand how we can do that. So what we've observed is when we get to a more genetically diverse crops, we see the real increasing importance of the context that they're being grown in and the processes that support that being to be understood and documented as best as possible. But really like building up that trust in bottom up rather than top down approaches. I'm going to pass over to Fred now because he's had a great experience of trying to work with that on Groundswell farm.
Do you want to click on that? Thank you, Charlotte. Hi everyone, I'm Fred, and as I said, I farm at Groundswell Farm in Bridgewater in Somerset, where I've been since 2007. And I guess to level with you all, I think probably the first half of my farming life I spent coming to terms with feeling trapped by a kind of high input, chemical intensive agricultural system. And the perspective I wanted to bring today really was how heterogeneous material populations, specifically the YQ for me, played a really big role in a transition away from that to a farm that felt a bit more ecological, and a farm that was embedded in a food system that was a bit more human scale. On the way here this morning, drove down, I don't know, I did Google when I came here, but anyway, I was looking out the window, I don't know quite where I was, but there was wheat everywhere it seemed, I don't know, every other field, every third field. And just for perspective, 1 in 6 of those fields, that's 15% of all the wheat grown in the UK, 250,000 hectares, there's one single variety, probably, KWS Extes. That's 2.5 million tonnes of wheat grown in the UK, where every single grain is genetically identical to the next one. And I'm not trying to say that KWS is a bad wheat, obviously quite the opposite. It's a brilliantly adapted wheat, but that's exactly the problem. It's a victim of its own success. As a farmer growing KWS Extes, in 2 years you'll have to replace it, it will break down to disease. And that's the picture on your right hand side. On the left is YQ, which as we've said is a population wheat. So 20 parents in YQ's case, 190 crosses, maybe 500,000 different genotypes in the same field. So YQ is as diverse as Extes is uniform. And what that kind of genetic diversity that YQ has, it brings a kind of evolutionary potential, and breeders call this mass selection. Farmers, we understand it as farm-safe seed. Sowing, harvesting, re-sowing the same seed on the same farm year after year. And the impact this has on the population is that it adapts, evolves, endures. If Extes has a kind of inbuilt obsolescence, YQ is resilient. And consider this, I could grow YQ for the rest of my farming life, and it wouldn't need to be replaced, it would probably get better. And that's really powerful. John and I are the farmers up here, and I first visited John's farm 5 or 6 years ago, and with hindsight it had a very profound effect on me. John's crops felt wonderfully productive and abundant, and I really couldn't believe at the time that was between drilling and harvest, there was no intervention in the field. When the tractor and the drill left, the next thing in was with the combine. And John told me this, and I just didn't believe him as a conventional farmer and a spray contractor at the time. And I left really with a different kind of perspective. That at home I had been trying to impose myself on the system. That everything had become a battle, and that I was trying to adapt and change my environment to grow the wheats that I wanted to grow. I guess it was the first kind of sense I had of what feeling ecocentric was, compared with the kind of ecocentric model that I'd been pursuing at home. And the YQ was a big part of this mental shift for me, because in the YQ I'd found a wheat, a heterogeneous wheat, a population wheat, that would over time adjust to the characteristics and the challenges of my farm. So, in terms of breeding terminology, the YQ is an adaptive variety. The X-Dace is adapted. And then we fast forward to the last kind of 4 or 5 years when I met most of these lovely people here, including Rosie, who has her bakery on the farm, Field Bakery. And that's really a reflection of, I realised that there's only so far you can change your practices as a farmer without considering the wider economic context of the farm. And the business that I was running was really deeply embedded in the commodity system of agriculture, and that brings with it a relentless focus on yield and scale and therefore simplicity. And the other thing with a commoditized system of the commoditized food system is effectively you are very disconnected from the consumer. So there's no way of communicating the values embodied within a different approach that I've seen at John's. And I wanted a grain economy that would support me as a farmer in deciding how I wanted to farm and work backwards. And you know, with hindsight, the YQ population took me on that journey as well. Because if the X-Dace is a variety that's defined by its uniformity, then YQ is defined by the people and the place and the farm on which it grew. It's absolutely a human identity, and that kind of identity is really powerful. And around a wheat like YQ, relationships and trust can build. And a much more connected human-scale food system can emerge. It's a system in which me as the farmer, I felt empowered to make my own decisions and choices on the farm. And it's a system that empowers everyone in the chain. And one of those people is the breeder. So we have a very own seed breeder up here today, Ed Dicken. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you very much, Fred. So, I got started out in this sort of grainy world with interest in naked barley. Naked barley is barley for human food. So it threshes freely from the husk, and you can use it in all sorts of products. Why do you want to eat barley? Well, it tastes delicious, first of all. It's a low input crop, as we all know. It gives more options in our rotations. But naked barley also has health benefits. It can help lower cholesterol and deal with type 2 diabetes by moderating the release of glucose into blood sugar. Unfortunately, we don't eat very much barley, and the varieties that are suited for human food just are very, very rare. And the key reason for that is the breeder and the user, as in the farmer, are different people, as we saw in Charlotte's and Fred's presentation. And where the breeder is a different person, they're trying to breed for a market. That market has to be there to make it worthwhile breeding the variety in the first place. So with a small but growing market, that's why naked barley got forgotten about. So I started doing my own crosses, and that got me on to the idea that it's not just important what you cross with what, it's how you handle the material afterwards. So in conventional breeding, you're trying to breed for a market, you're trying to produce a product that you can sell, and it needs to be on the national list to legally sell it. It needs to be DUS. So you're trying to get towards a uniform product, And the 20th century way of doing that is the pedigree method, where you do a cross, the F1 self-pollinates to the F2s, and you usually have about 2,000 to 3,000 F2s that then become the plant families, and then you select within and between them. And then you can speed that up a bit with marker-assisted selection. You won't need to go into that a lot, but the fundamental goal is to get to a uniform type of variety. Whereas me with naked barley, I thought, well, I don't actually need to do that. I'm making crosses with Tibetan or Syrian, very diverse barleys crossed into UK varieties. And then I'm not wanting to throw away a lot of that diversity, so why not keep it? So that's what I've been doing, partly as a bit of a hobby, partly with the students at Harper Adams, and now we've got funding through Horizon 2020 programme, a project called Crop Diva, Climate Resilient Orphan Crops for Diversity in Agriculture. So we're also doing intercropping as part of that. But through that link with people involved in diverse grains, things also got into landrace wheats. Landrace wheats are like, you think of them as a traditional breed, similar to traditional breeds of livestock. And this is from when the farmer and the breeder are the same people. A landrace develops with the culture of where it's been growing to suit the food systems and the types of growing. So I started taking some of these and crossing them into modern wheats. Modern wheats aren't all bad by any means. There's some very, very useful traits, things like orange bottom midge resistance, higher yields, better standing ability. And again, it seems a bit of a waste to then try and produce a uniform variety. Partly because I'm not a professional plant breeder, I'm not going to try and get stuff on the recommended list. So I started making crosses, and I'd had the pleasure to have met Martin Wolf, so I started stealing his idea and making my own population. So my own population is all of these different diverse, modern crossed with land races, then mixed together. So far there's only 20 crosses, whereas YQ is 190. But each of those crosses, potentially, we've got 2,000 to 3,000 individual combinations. One of the things about these landrace wheats, they are very resilient. This is a picture taken in 2018. You can see the modern wheat growing on quite light land, it's just given up. Whereas on the same day, the crosses from the land races, they've still got colour in them, they're still filling. Their specific weight was they'd filled properly, they'd finished, because they've got a better root system. 2022, we had a drought again. You can see the wheat turning white, apart from that next to it, which is rivet wheat. Rivet wheat is a forgotten type of wheat. It's related to durum wheat, but it's durum's tough northern cousin in a way. And we grew it up to the 1950s and then forgot about it. So my population, calling Oak Farm population, again stealing the idea of Martin Wolf. So Wakelin's after Martin Wolf's farm, Oak Farm after my parents' farm. And these photos are anecdotes rather than scientific evidence, but the scientific papers show that populations, blends, they do reduce the amount of disease considerably. So these were grown in the same field a couple of years ago, and you can see they've had the same fungicide program. Anybody who's a conventional farmer, we know we're losing fungicides as well, and you can see a lot greener. There are other advantages of keeping some of that resilience and keeping the diversity. The picture there is a DUS inspector's nightmare. You can see the wheat is all different heights. And one of the conversations we had with Steve Jones, he said, well, if you've got 10 to 15% tall ones, that's an extra canopy, and they're not going to shade out the ones below, so you've got an extra layer of canopy going down through it. So it looks stuffy, but you actually get an advantage. And some of those tall ones, if you were selecting individual varieties, you'd have to throw them away, because if you just grow a whole field of those really tall ones with the lodging, but whereas they're part of the mix, they're fine. So this got me thinking about it's the system of plant breeding, not just the genetics. So oak farm population has more than genetics in it, but it's the system to try and get to uniform varieties, because the breeder and the farmer are different people. And that wasn't always the case, and it's not the case today with livestock. If you've read some of the works of James Rebanks, he's talking about adapting his genetics of the sheep and the cattle, going back to belted Galloways, to suit forage, rather than having to reseed with ryegrass and use fertiliser and lime and bought-in concentrate. So a livestock farmer, especially if they're going on a more regenerative path, whatever you want to define regenerative as, they're adapting their genetics to suit their system. But with crops, we have to decide what system we'd like to farm, like Fred was telling us, and then try and find some genetics that fits in with that from a list of products that are available. So one of the real powers of this method of breeding is, as you saw on Charlotte's slide, it reintegrates the breeder and the farmer. There's no reason why a breeder and a farmer can't be different people. So this is oak farm population. You can see again, looking wonderfully scruffy, but it's also pretty as well. So one of the other things I'm playing around with is crossing a rivet, so Durham's tough northern cousin, into Khorasan wheat, which produces beautiful pasta, and Khorasan wheat does, but you can't really grow it here. When you do a cross, I've done a bit of selection in to get the best ones, but produce something that will make very, very good pasta, grows fairly reliably, yield isn't too bad. It's absolute pig to combine. I don't know if you can see them in that picture, but it tends to get bunches gathered up at the edge. But what it does do is produce loads and loads of straw, and the worms absolutely love it. So that field now, we direct around it with beans, and that really worked really well. You can see the worms pulling down that straw. And that's again one thing we've forgotten about, that the job of the crop is to produce food for the soil as well. So I will pass myself on to Steve.
Thanks very much, Ed. So I'm going to start with why would I'm Steve Jacobs from Organic Farmers and Growers, with the largest certified organic land in the UK. Why would an organic farm be interested in a population? So let's start at the beginning. There's an Organics 101. You probably all know this. We don't bring on synthetics, fertiliser, it's all about cycling nutrients. Here it's clover, also use of livestock. And so what's the problem that we've got with the current seed breeding programs is that they aren't built for this system. They're built for the system that's been described, where the plants are bred in order to grow in a system that will require synthetic inputs, artificial fertiliser, fungicide, etc., etc. Organic farmers can't use those, don't use those, so what do we do instead? And how did we get into this position where these polarised situations have occurred, where there's a lot of synthetics on one side and nothing on the other? So this is a slide from, I've got three of these just quickly. This is just mapping out, this is down to Phil Howard, who is with Michigan State University and also IPES Food in Brussels. This is about agribusiness consolidation. Nothing wrong with that, it's not illegal. Big companies buy smaller companies all the time. But if you look at the progression, you can see that Bayer have just eaten Monsanto, and that we're down to even less companies. And of these companies, the big corporate owners tend to own both the seed houses and the businesses producing the synthetics you need to grow those varieties. It's not in every case, but it is dominating the landscape. And it's going on. It's still happening. So for us to go and grow these things, say for instance you've got to get 1 million wheat spec, a non-organic farmer can put synthetics on and try and encourage more protein. An organic farmer can't do that. I want organic grains, what am I going to do? So I'm just going to pay respect now to somebody who couldn't be with us today, unfortunately, Kimberly Bell, because it was through Josiah that I met Kim. Kim is a baker at Small Food Bakery in Nottingham, and she introduced me into a way that we could use Martin's YQ in a loaf of bread. Because my problem was, I could persuade organic farmers to grow the YQ, but who are they going to sell it to? So that's where the bakers come in. We'll hear from Rosie in a second. So my last slide, guess which one is the YQ and which one is the modern variety? I'll tell you, the YQ is the one without any poppies in it. Pretty as they are, obviously, that's a weed. This photo was from Mark Lee, who's an organic farmer in Shropshire, incidentally hosting the National Organic Conference next week. This, Mark says, is his best photo ever. I'm sure he's got brilliant photos of his kids, but this is a pretty good photo. The point here that's being illustrated here is that the YQ, the Wakelins population, will outcompete the weeds in an organic system where you cannot use herbicide. So Mark has reduced his ploughing, he's cultivating with various lighter tillage systems, he's got living mulch, he's got his crop rotation, his fertility build is clover and livestock, and this wheat really suits his system. And talking of farmers, I'll now hand you over to John Turner.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you. Yeah, so John Turner, we farm in sort of southwest Lincolnshire, just above Stamford, and like Fred, we sort of try, we do take sort of an innovative approach. We always try and remain open to what, you know, where we want to be 5, 10, 15 years time, but we're also what I call brutally commercial. It has got to stack up, you know, at the end of the day, the rent's got to be paid, the machinery's got to be paid for, and that sort of thing. So we, you know, probably more so than you know, one or two others, have to focus on how we get from where we want to be to what we can actually do tomorrow very, very quickly. Our introduction to diverse grounds, population grounds, I think Kim must have been doing quite a lot of badgering in 2017, because we normally sit down at this time of the year with the windmills and with the bakers and say, okay, what do you want us to plant this autumn? We do the entire mapping for the next cropping year now, and they have to make a commitment that what comes off the fields in, well, it'll be 2024, they will be buying right through to 2025, and that's a real trust. It's a relationship based on trust, and you know, we do our part, they do their part, and that's what makes it all work. And I think you're very much the same, aren't you, Fred? So 2017, we would sit down with the mill, what do we want to be growing, and Paul at Tuxford Windmill said, look, we supplied Kim at Small Food with quite a lot of flour, she wants us to grow some YQ under this commercial trial. I said, yep, well that's it, she's going to commit to buying it, and we will grow it, certainly. Popped it in the ground, and it was only then that we sort of started to understand the legislative context of this. It was done under a commercial experiment, and that market is an important one because it's not only the legislation that controls the seed and the availability of the seed, but in the farming world it also actually, you know, controls the marketing. If you're selling a milling wheat off, on that passport you've got to have the name of the milling wheat, and that's got to be a recognised name of milling wheat. There's no way I can put YQ on my passport. I've got absolutely no interest in producing food for animal feed on our farm. You know, we're trying to do stuff for human consumption. So yeah, back to that conversation with Kim and the commercial experiment. We put it in, and I was quite sceptical for the first autumn. You know, we put it in, and compared with the other stuff, we thought this really isn't very special. But come the spring, I mean, that just kept going and going and going. And when all the other single varieties started that senescence that Ed was talking about, they kept going, and it was the best yielding. And that's been the same. We've grown that every year. We've farm safe seed that. That has developed as a local land race on our farm for 6 years. I would put this spring, this autumn and next spring, I would put all crops down to population if there was the market for it. So in terms of where we're going from now for the next sort of tranche of this sort of commercial experiment, the development work, is to start to look at that marketing and how we start to take that to scale. And that's going to be all about building confidence. Charlotte mentioned the 1964 Plant Varieties Act. That came in to sort of give us a structure to enable farmers to buy seed with confidence that what they thought they were buying was actually what they were buying, and that it was disease-free and it was going to perform. And we need those same sort of guarantees or confidence building if we're going to take this forward to scale. That commercial experiment that framed, that gave us the space for this initial tranche of work to happen was an EU one. And one of the objectives of that ORC worked with DEFRA was about whether you can actually identify and authenticate a seed by its traceability, by tracing it back through the generations, rather than an inspector going into a field saying, yeah, that's my control, and yes, that's the same as that. Because you've got an incredibly diverse one, and I think even us who have been growing it for 5 or 10 years and looking at a YQ, it's a sort of almost as a gut feeling, yes, that is YQ, or there's quite a few off types in here. So this traceability is a really important factor. Originally, on that initial experiment, this was done on a spreadsheet, and poor old Charlotte and her colleagues in the office had to maintain that, keep firing that into it to DEFRA, and it was fairly clear that as one farmer then sold it to another farmer and it was swapped, maintaining that contact and gathering that data is going to be even more difficult. So what I'm going to do is give you a very quick walk through a tool called Heterogen, which we've developed collectively, which will hopefully take us from the initial process of putting on a spreadsheet to one where everybody as a grower or as a merchant can maintain records of what they're doing, and that reduces the central admin burden. So this is a sort of a shared responsibility in delivering the same objectives that 1964 Plant Act was intended to deliver, but by taking ownership of it, taking responsibility of it, hopefully we can make that 1964 Act redundant. That's where we're hoping to go, certainly I'm hoping to go. So each of them, and actually heterogen is the sort of the name of gen being information, heterogen, it's a sort of reflection of it. Throughout its development, it's been informally called John's tool, so I'm really pleased that we've moved on to heterogen, and I'm far happier with that. So everyone takes ownership of their business, when in this case it's us, little person on the map, and a little bit of a sort of a bioc of the farm. And the idea is that in the next iteration of the development, what we can do is sort of have a link from the profile, so that somebody goes into the field, QR code, they can learn about the farm and about the crop. The farmer will be able to map the fields just simply by clicking on a dot. Oh, that's me done 7 minutes, sorry about that. Farmers must stop talking. So they can map the fields very, very quickly. There's a traceability process, which is basically, it monitors the seed coming in. So when, let's say, that initial batch of seed came from Fred to me, on my dashboard, the only thing I would have on that is seed that's come in from a supplier that is on the system already. So hence that sort of, I know that I'm getting it from an authenticated source. Throughout me growing it, I map the fields that it's gone in, the seed rate, the area, and also I can do the harvesting data, what it's yielded, things like grain quality, protein, hagbird, those sorts of things. And if it's going on to seed as well, either as farm safe seed for me or sell to another person, we put that germination rate, we put in the phytosanitary stuff, make sure that we're not taking bunt and septoria and passing that on to somebody else. So that's how we're hoping to deliver these sort of standards, a professional standard that these crops really deserve. And also by compiling that sort of information, What we can do is build a picture of, let's say, for Oak Farm or YQ, typically what would farmers expect in real life situations about protein, yield, hang birth, its usage, that sort of thing, and build that real life picture based on that farmer participation, which is the sort of innovative farmers and live with sort of approach to things. If we're placing it onto seed, what we'll do is generate a seed label, and that forms part of a family tree. And this is, at the moment, we're just using some dummy data, which we've used to test the system. We're going to have a session, I think, this afternoon between 2 and 3 on the agroecology stand. And if anybody's interested, we can just take you through it. But every new seed label goes onto this family tree, and that's traceable right back to that very first source, the work that Martin put in, the work that Ed's put in, and hopefully, you know, in 5 and 10 years' time, we'll be dealing with a lot more populations. Why bother? I think we need to think what the alternative is. This can, let's be honest, this can continue. It can happen under the radar, little farmer-to-farmer bits of seed being exchanged. But if we want to take this, if we want to, you know, I feel if we want to really unlock the true potential of these crops, unlock the markets for them, it needs to be a collaborative approach. And everybody in there has got a part to play. Farmers have got a part to play, breeders, and we've got this wonderful system that I think has evolved over, you know, the course of this temporary experiment, where we've got these very close connections, you know, almost from the harvest. I can say how it's grown, we can pass it on to the miller, he'll tell us how it's milled, Rosie can tell us how it's baked, and that goes straight back to Ed and the breeders, and you get a very fast information exchange. Talking of millers and bakers, over to Rosie.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. So I'm Rosie, and I have a brilliant bakery on Gotham Farm called The Old Bakery. It's about an hour down from Bristol on the M5, if you ever pass them. It's open every Saturday to the general public, and that means mainly locals to the farms. There's a lot of villages close by, other farmers, lots of farming families often come to the farm. And ironically, being someone that lives in the countryside, often access to good food is quite evasive. So this has been a real joy for the people that live around there, actually, to come to the farm. And you often look up from pulling loads out of the oven and just see everyone chatting in the queue and getting to know each other, and that's a really good part of having a bakery on the farm. So just in context, I've been baking for about 7 years before I started the bakery at Gothany. I've mainly worked with commodity white flour, so very low extraction, white monoculture wheat. It didn't have much flavour. I was sourdough fermenting it, so I was feeling a bit more happy about that because I was putting more nutrition into the bread, but I knew there was a big problem there to be solved of where that grain was coming from and what system it was supporting. So I moved to London for a bit, worked at E5 Bakehouse, which was committed to using UK grown organic wheat, and that was a big learning curve because they fresh mill in the bakery. I met lots of people there, such as Kim at Small Food, who's been really inspirational as another baker who's championing these diverse wheats. And I also met Fred around that same time, came to the farm, started to have a lot more conversations about what his parameters were and me as a baker, what I was looking for, and we aligned on a lot of values around the climate crisis and wanting to do something about it. So I think a lot of bakers might feel like I did in the past, quite overwhelmed with the problem and the scale of the problem, and think, how can I actually get involved in doing something positive? So using Grain Direct was actually one of those things that I could do. There was a little baking excursion to America where I started baking over there for about 7 months, and I worked in bakeries that contained a mill in, importantly, and they were working direct with farmers, and I tasted some amazing breads. And I think having those experiences really gave me the confidence to set up the bakery at the farm, because I knew that bread could be better than what was available in our supermarkets, if we can all even call that bread. So this is what I have to work with. lots of populations, lots of different mixtures. These are from different farms, not just fed. It gets cleaned on farm so that it's milling quality, cleanliness, wheat. And then we mill it on this new American stone mill, which is a 40-inch stone mill. It's built in Vermont, and I spent a lot of time with the mill maker and the bakers working with this mill over in the States. They're now all over the world, so they're really taking over in terms of that kind of connected, small-scale milling, getting grains out to people's plates locally. So they're a really good tool, and we share that tool. So Fred and I co-own it because I also mill for other bakeries. Importantly, I didn't want to hold on to this beautiful experience of working with fresh flour. I wanted to spread it as far as wide within my network that I could. So I do a lot of wholesale, whole grain flour to other bakeries. We also have workshops for those bakers to encourage them to use this flour and to show them techniques and basically build their skill level. I think that's something that I'd like to mention is, as a baker, there's only so far you can go with white flour, and there's so much more to learn. There's so much more flavour out of using diverse grain, and so much more beauty in the job and connection with other people who work in this. So farmers, millers, bakers, all of them hanging out a bit more together and sort of learning from each other. So this is doing a workshop. We do a lot of workshops, not just beginner sourdough workshops, but with professional bakers. On the left there is some loaves that I made out of 3 Southwest farmers' grain. All made beautiful loaves, really tasty, all 100% stone ground flour, some of them are 100% YQ as well. And I just wanted to prove the point that bakers with skills in sourdough fermentation can actually work with wheats that are actually outside of the very narrow parameters that bigger scale mills set up. And I also think about every time I'm mixing dough, how's that been grown, the people involved in it, and it brings me a lot of joy to actually give that to my customers. I feel really proud of the bread that we put out to people, and I think that's an experience that I'd love other bakers to be part of. Here is the Southwest Grain Network doing its thing, getting together, learning about milling here, learning a bit about farming as well at Gothany. So we try and get together regularly. There's lots more plans in the future of how we can do that even better. And there's a real conversation within the group about how to use diverse wheats and how to get hold of some of these populations, which is going to be great for us as a community to all be buying into it and all be using it and learning from each other. This is a workshop. So often we'll spend some of the time in the bakery in the morning, mixing doughs, feeling things, talking about our experiences of working with these flours, and then we'll spend a lot of time in the afternoon outside with Fred in the field looking at diverse wheat. So this is in the trial plot, which is beautiful because it's a patchwork of heights and colours, and at nearer to harvest it gets really, really beautiful. Yeah, we're really lucky to be able to see that, and I think that experience of spending time on a farm as a baker who might not have been able to access that before, so even going on to a farm through a farm gate can often feel a bit intimidating. I think this is a really good way of getting more people involved, so opening farms up, not every day, but occasionally is a good idea. And just to show you what we do, this is all made with YQ wheat, which is one of the populations that I work with. Obviously different other things have gone into there, butter being one of the main other ingredients. I do wholesale bread into Bristol as well to a couple of restaurants and to a very nice big bread club who are committed to supporting the farm and what we do here. And they're all aware of what we do and how these grains are grown, importantly. So they trust in Fred and I to bring that food to them and make decisions for them that benefit their own nutrition and their enjoyment of food. And they keep coming back, so I think it's working. And yeah, I think I'd like to pass over we've done that. Oh, one thing to mention is we did make biscuits. I did make biscuits, and they're fresh milled whole grain flour from 3 populations developed by these guys here, as well as Wakelins from Martin Wolf. And I'd like you to taste them and just take a minute to appreciate what good food is.
There we go, brilliant. Well, thanks everyone for that kind of really broad perspective about why it is that these diverse cereals are so important. They're resilient, they're tasty, they're nutritious, they bring together communities, they offer a part of the answer to those complex questions that we were discussing right at the beginning. And I think what's been really critical in this journey that we've been on over the last 4 years is that we've been talking to DEFRA, we've been talking to other stakeholders, as you might broadly call them, who are conventional breeders, and trying to understand how we can assure those kind of very conventionally minded processes that we can kind of look after this process without spreading disease or undermining the role of the breeder, which is critically important. We need to reward that work that people like Ed are doing. And much to our surprise, to be honest, last week we had some communication from DEFRA that, and this is my Neville Chamberlain moment, let's hope that this doesn't come home to haunt me, but DEFRA put before Parliament a statutory instrument. That's a piece of secondary legislation that doesn't need to be debated in Parliament. It's essentially an amendment to the 2011 seed marketing rules, which essentially says that for the next 7 years, until 2030, from the 13th of July this year, we can run another experiment looking at how these diverse cereals might fit into the picture of UK agriculture. This will allow us to demonstrate, one, that we're all very responsible and a safe pair of hands, as it were, but also that there are other metrics, there are other things we need to be measuring when we look at whether a cereal is suitable for production on farms. And that includes the connection, that includes the flavour and the nutrition, that includes the adaptive capacity to particular agro-ecosystems. And we're going to use this 7 years to demonstrate that in the hope that we can convince DEFRA and the government, whoever that may be at that time, and who knows, that we can change the primary legislation, that we can adapt that 1964 Act to prevent the criminalisation of farmers. Because, as has been said, it is possible to swap and exchange those seeds. It's technically not really the correct thing to be doing. But if we're going to really spread this out across the farming community, we need to do it openly and transparently and with kind of demonstrable benefits, not kind of backhanders. And that problem that existed and that created the 1964 Act, which was farmers not knowing what it was that they were growing on their farms, and disreputable seed merchants selling material that wasn't what it was supposed to be. So it's incredibly exciting. Delicious biscuits from Field Bakery. Very little time, but we have got time for a couple of questions, I think. So if anyone has a question, Ben. There's a microphone, but
Thanks. Ben Reynolds from Sustain. So in this next trial, if you get it, fingers crossed, what seeds, what cereals would you be trialling, and for what market? Would it still be ultimately for flour and bakeries, or?
It could be anything. It's very open. So all the main cereal species are included, and the definition of what is a heterogenous crop is very wide as well. So it'll include those land races, it'll include things that have been developed on farms through mixtures that have been outcrossed, it'll include things like YQ. And we've talked a lot about YQ. YQ is not the answer. Martin never felt it was the answer. YQ has been the wedge that's opened the door and helped us to think differently about all of this cereal work. So we hope there'll be a whole new wave of things like Ed is doing, creating a Khorasan Rivet cross that's brilliant for pasta. There could be all sorts of things that emerge from this. Oh, yep.
Hi, thanks for that. That was really interesting. Do you think it's possible to legitimise existing other populations through this online platform? Or is it more the case that populations will have to be born out of this sort of coming existing framework and sort of carefully identify, track and trace from now, or can you sort of go retrospectively almost?
We can go retrospectively. Charlotte's probably better placed to.
Yeah, we're going to work to build back the records so we can start to build a picture of what these seeds do, where they've been. It will rely on us all working together to unpick the historic information. But yeah, that's why we're really excited to get everyone involved as best as possible, so best foot forward, so we can really build up a story of what we can expect from populations that goes beyond IQ. Because sometimes we make generalisations on what a population does based on a single experience, so we really want to get as many people involved to broaden that up.
I think the conversation with DEFRA is also going to be continuing on throughout this, because it's not just the legislation, from 1964 that shaped violence. It's also all the processes that are built up in that time around it. And at the moment, the starting point is quite a formalised way of agreeing what is a new population, what is a land race. So I think that is a conversation that needs to evolve. We need to demonstrate the strength and the potential from these local land races, from farmer breeding and that sort of thing, and have something that is far more fluid, far more dynamic. It's really important that there's that integrity, that it has a unique identity, that what we're not doing is by the back door just opening up somebody who's mixing 3 or 4 varieties and calling it a land race. There has got to be something genuinely new about this. But if there is something genuinely new, I think it's in everybody's interest to get that recorded, start to build up these family trees and understand how they're evolving, understand the value of them.
I just wanted to add, the other thing is the value of them in the supply chain. So Josiah said it, Rosie said it, is that what are you growing it for, where's your market? So one of the things that this group and working with groups across the country is to look at how we can get, starting off with small scale, people growing for food rather than just as a commodity, people being able to connect with the customer directly if possible, and developing crops that suit the human gut and soils without synthetics, and joining that circle.
One more, then we're really pushing it, and everyone needs a biscuit, so one more question. Vanessa at the front, then, you've got the questions. Super quick one.
Sorry about that. It's always about time when someone's calling you and you're about to ask a question. You spoke about developing crops for the gut microbiome. I've just finished my doctorate, and that's on the impact of bread on the gut microbiome and mental health. And I wondered if any of the population grains have been developed specifically with diversity and higher levels of polyphenols in them as a cheap source of the fibres that can optimally feed the gut. I wondered if anybody's worked on those that framework of actually developing to optimally nourish the gut. So rather than feeding people, nourishing them.
I think that is ultimately the aim. Polyphenol testing is very expensive. We haven't done much of that. I suspect that if we were to start doing that, we'd find that some of the work that Ed and others are doing would suggest higher levels than in some of the monocultural varieties. Talking of nourishment, and I know that time's running out, please come and get a biscuit. Oh, sorry. And there are biscuits at the back too. Where are the biscuits? Biscuit people. Front, back. You can't leave without a biscuit, so go and get a biscuit. Taste the diversity of the